Okay, ladies and gentlemen and aliens and all concerns and spirits from beyond. Hello, my name's Steven Higson, but you probably sort of know me already. And I'm convening the Sea of Faith meeting for Melbourne, or the physical meeting anyway. There's one that goes online with David Miller. Sea of Faith is sort of a worldwide organisation which came forth from Don Cupid's 6-episode documentary. And it was a lovely documentary, as the BBC will tend to make, very, very nice stuff. And the issue there was the last 5 centuries and the growth of science and the, you might say, the debasement of the medieval religion. And so Don thought, well, what's the issue there? And it is a big issue. Friedrich Nietzsche famously pointed out, after giving it much thought, that actually debasing the civilization of its religion, even though he was a virulent atheist, would create quite powerful issues. And so I've come to think that actually what the Sea of Faith embraces is, and will remain for a long time, a very topical issue. This meeting's been going here for about 20 years. David Miller ran it for many years, and then Rowan ran it. Unfortunately, Rowan passed away last year, and so I've sort of been taking care of things since then. And well, we'll see how we get along. We've got a very crowded meeting tonight by our standards. Anyway, tonight, Natalia, who did a year of theology, which she greatly enjoyed, she keeps on wishing she was back there in the ornate church halls listening to the Christian professors. So tonight, Natalia is going to talk about a standard theological question, the contribution of Genesis 1 to 11 to a contemporary Christian vision. Well, 1 to 11 in Genesis is everything up till Abraham. So it's about the first half of the book of Genesis. And effectively, what preceded Abraham's God, or Abraham's vision of God's. And so this was the common province of the humanity of Samaria or whatever, and they, of course, have a sort of a similar tradition, the flood story and so on in the Levantine stories. Anyway, okay, Natalia, you can take it away now.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Natalia. I'm currently a student. I'm studying the Master of Teaching for Early Childhood and Primary at Australian Catholic University, or ACU for short. So prior to that, actually back in 2018, I pursued the Bachelor of Animation and Interactive Media for about maybe 3.5 years. And then I had some sort of like an existential crisis, which sort of led me to pursue the study of a Diploma of Theology at the Trinity Theological College in 2022. And, well, before I get into that, so if you haven't already known me, so I had prior given 2 presentations at the online Zoom meeting. It's called the Existential Society. It's run by David Miller. So the first topic that I presented back in 2022 was the Christianization of Europe. And the second one, that was back in 2023, the first 1,000 years of Christianization of Europe. And then the second topic was Oswald Spengler on the destiny of Western Boston culture, early this year. So I'm grateful to be offered another opportunity opportunity to present the talk tonight at Steven Higson's Sea of Faith meeting on the topic, the contribution of Genesis 1 to 11 to contemporary Christian vision of humanity. So, just to give a broad introduction. So, it's worth noting how Western literature and history has been dominated by allegories or discourse. So discourse, I assume it means like conversations, like with different theologians alike.
I'll turn the lights on.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and allegories basically like poetry and sort of persuasive writing, and this includes classical and medieval texts such as Dante's Divine Comedy and John Milton's Paradise Lost, where abstract moral and philosophical ideas that were portrayed within a fictional framework. So the characters that were portrayed within the parables, perhaps coincidentally or maybe deliberately, they intersect with the values within the biblical allegories, such as the story of Paul in the book of Acts, where he had a vision of, or he was in Damascus, he had a vision of Christ, and then later on he attained salvation from him. And another story from the Bible is Adam and Eve, from Genesis chapter 3. So although they were banished from the Garden of Eden, they were then promised future salvation with their descendants if they continued to live in God's grace. So, just to get into the gist of things, so Genesis chapter 1 to 11 contains a pattern where, as author Ernest Lucas puts it, is each act of sin being met by an act of grace. So, in that sense, he's essentially saying that each of the chapters within Genesis 1 to 11 contain details that lead up to the events of the Babylonian exile. So first, it was the introduction to the original sin by the first couple, and then B, the punishment of God, as well as the protection. So in this sense, God intervened with human affairs in a good and a bad way. And also the blessing, the series of blessings that he had bestowed upon humanity in the hopes of redemption. And also the formation of a covenant with the early peoples in the Hebrew narrative. And it's evident in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when God said to the serpent, "He will strike your head," and that's the NRSV Catholic Bible version. "He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." Or you can also say, "He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." So in this sense, he in this sense refers to Jesus, the offspring that is the promise for redemption. But the Old Testament didn't actually mention Jesus until a bit later in the New Testament, but the author mentioned the word offspring quite a few times. And so there's actually a great significance within these two verses, and they're sort of in contrast with each other. So firstly, when God predicted that the offspring will strike the serpent's head, he's essentially saying that the good will defeat the bad, or Satan, right? Satan in this sense is the serpent. And then secondly, when the serpent strikes the offspring's heel, it sort of just means like a fatal blow, like it's a mortal blow that Jesus can sort of withstand, and it's only temporary. And then later on, he will be resurrected, because in the Trinitarian doctrine, Jesus is both God and man, right? So he has that capacity to endure pain, not just physical, but also, divine.
Sorry, where? You said in the something, in the where?
Sorry? The what?
God and man. In where is it written?
Trinity.
Where?
It's a Trinity.
Should it say?
The Nicene, was it the Nicene Creed?
Oh.
Yeah, so now I'll just move on to outlining the prologue before I do the actual presentation.
Oh, not there yet.
No. Getting there. Alright.
It's just
For many decades, the narratives of Genesis chapters 1 to 11 have become the subject of debate among biblical and scientific scholars. Contemporary scientists have made attempts to prove the legitimacy of the account by arguing against its perspective on creation, origins, and human history. Although early scientists like Darwin had challenged the account of Adam and Eve's lineage in Genesis chapters 2 to 5 through the natural selection theory, modern scientists like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, and Neil deGrasse Tyson argued how the universe could have been created through physics. Interestingly, Christian apologist William Lane Craig stipulated how the Big Bang theory supports the existence of a creator God, aligning with the theological view of creation ex nihilo, or that which the universe was created from nothing. Similarly, apologist John Lennox posited how the account of Genesis focuses more on who created the universe rather than the duration and method of its creation. Debate centered around the early chapters of Genesis rose during the 19th to the early 20th centuries, particularly in the 1920s, when creationism arose as a reactionary movement against modernism. These two movements differed in their interpretation of the biblical narratives. One assuming science as the only reliable form of knowledge, and the latter as viewing all organisms today having the same substance as those created by God thousands of years ago. The idea of organisms having a similar substance to one another originates from the testimony of the imago Dei, or Latin word for the image of God, mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, when God created man in his own image, or in his likeness. However, this is not to say that the imago Dei is central to the cause of the creationist movement. Rather, it acts as a foundation that underpins the resistance to the evolutionary theory posited by scientists. As famous author Sam Harris had summarized, one could pursue the spiritual life through self-exploration and connection with human experience, a belief contrary to Ravi Zakaria, an apologist, who posited how true spirituality can only be found in forming a covenant with God who embodied absolute moral values. So that was the end of the prologue. I'll just move on with the slides now.
so you should have watched your office.
Alright, so that's the topic that I'm going to explore for today, the contribution of Genesis 1 to 11 to contemporary Christian vision. So just to give sort of a context before we dive into things. So what's the book of Genesis all about? So from chapters 1 to 2 of Genesis, it outlines a detailed account of how God created the world in 6 days, followed by the creation of the first human beings, Adam and Eve. And later on in chapter 3, we usually label it as fall, or the fall of humanity. It was caused by the first ancestors because they ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. So from that sin of them listening to the serpent and eating the forbidden fruit, it caused suffering. It caused them to feel a sense of shame and the discovery that they're all naked, and the loss of innocence, the introduction of sin and suffering into the world through their descendants. So from chapters 4 to 11, it sort of like gives an outline as well as how sin and the consequences of it spreads to the first descendants of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, where Cain murdered his own brother, right? He tricked and he murdered him. near a cliff, I think. And from Genesis chapters 12 to 15, it was when the Israelite nation was established. And the founding fathers were chosen to represent each of those nations. And each of these patriarchs, they have formed a covenant with God to rule over that nation. And so, well, just to sort of break it down a bit, in Genesis chapters 12 to 25, it outlines the journey of Abraham, right, and the series of setbacks that he faced while he was trying to build the kingdom of faith. So, for example, we have the story where the Egyptian pharaoh tried to threaten Abraham's life by sort of threaten his life in Genesis chapter 12, and the fear of the invasion of the Philistines in Genesis chapter 20, because that was, I think, the neighboring, country or nation, and also the abuse of Hagar by both Abraham and Sarah. So I think Hagar was also the wife of Abraham. So I think Abraham had two wives at the time. It was Hagar, and later on Sarah was appointed as his wife. And also his own family members, they had doubts about this, the promise of the kingdom of God that was going to be built in Israel. And Genesis chapters 25 to 36 was outlining the life of Jacob and the establishment of the 12 tribes of Israel. So in sum, the book of Genesis encapsulates ideas of creation, order, sin and its consequence, covenant, well, I should say covenants because he formed a few covenants with different people, with the story of Noah. It was through the rainbow that was sort of the covenants that he formed. Faith and obedience. So why do we focus on Genesis chapters 1 to 11? So earlier in the prologue, I did mention that author Ernest Lucas, which actually wrote the thesis interpreting Genesis in the 21st century. So he said that each act of sin was met by an act of grace. And he also outlined how Genesis chapters 1 to 11 provide insights to human identity, purpose, and relationship with God. So again, the idea that humans are made in the likeness of God. It means that God sort of views humanity as stewards of creation. Right? They look after the rest of creation. And Lucas referred to Genesis chapters 1 to 11 as a theological polemic. So polemic in the sense it's kind of like it's like a treatise or a persuasive text meant to sort of push an idea that sets it apart from the other beliefs that were prevalent during the time where the Hebrew creation story took place. So like the story, the creation myths from the Canaanites or the Sumerians or the Mesopotamian cultures. So it's just, think of it in a way like the early church fathers, like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius, where they actually created treatises against the early Christian heresies, like Marcionism, Gnosticism, and Arianism. So anyway, so Lucas further said Genesis 1 to 11 was a theological polemic. It sets out a Hebrew understanding of creation over theogonistic ideas. So there's the word theogony in that sense is opposite to cosmogony. So we know that theos means God. Theology means the study of God. And theogony in this sense means a system or an account of gods, right? And in Lucas's work, he elaborated how these gods, and he's referring to the gods of the ancient Near East, right? They brought the cosmos into being using a pre-existing matter of sorts. So I'll actually talk about this more in the upcoming slides, but when he's saying that basically it is contrary to the cosmogony, the idea that there is a pre-existing God that determines the origin of the cosmos, that breathes life and brings existence. Right? Theogony, cosmogony, cosmos, cosmology. So they're related, it's just semantics. So one way that contemporary Christians view Genesis 1-11 as a way of setting up like a framework of moral objectivity is looking at Genesis chapters 1-2 as setting out the framework for human identity and purpose. So as I have mentioned before, the term Imago Dei, it affirms the Christian perspective that all humans have rights, whether it's collective or individual, and they are equal to one another, right, regardless of their gender, race, or status, socioeconomical status. Because even at the time where the Hebrew creation story was made, there were people of all sorts. There were the elites, there were the lower class as well, in the middle. And here are just a few excerpts from the Bible that I've extracted that highlight the Christian notion of human identity and purpose. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image. Male and female, He created them." And verse 28, He said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth." Now, there's actually controversies which I will also outline in the next few slides. The word subdue and dominion can have negative connotations. And Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. "Every tree with seed in its fruit you shall have them for food." That was what God said to Adam. And Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it." So again, the word till, tilling, it sort of signifies that man has a role in looking after creation. He's a steward. So, the last point in this slide. So, when God says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night," it implies how these lights they exist to serve humans. In turn, humans utilize the lights as calendar markers. And so there is a sort of a reciprocal relationship between humanity and the rest of creation. There's God created the rest of creation and humanity in the sense that they will also, even though man is the steward, but they will look after the other, in a similar sense. Next, Genesis chapter 3. For contemporary Christians, this chapter highlights the prevalence of sin, evil, and human imperfection. So chapter 3 is where the fall occurred, and sin and suffering were first introduced due to Adam and Eve's disobedience towards God. So we can see that in in verses 6 to 7. "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, delight to the eyes, and destined to make one wise, she took off its fruit and ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked." And there's some of these terms. It's how do I describe it? So I will explore more about, especially the word naked, because in the Hebrew language, it sort of means it has a different kind of meaning as well, and it correlates to the snake's crafty nature, right? That the way that it tricks, that it tricked the women to eat the fruit. And in Genesis chapter 3 verse 10, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. So that was after the first sin of eating the forbidden fruit. Eve then realized she started feeling the sense of shame for the very first time. So, in a sense, it's one of the first original sin because that was when man first prioritizes the self over God, right? And they were tempted, and they were curious because they wanted to be like God. Although it's not explicitly mentioned here, but later on in the story of the Tower of Babel, you can see why they wanted to build a common language, and they wanted to build a tower that can reach the heavens. Okay, so Genesis chapters 4 to 11 is basically encompasses the idea of the spread of sin and God's judgment. So these chapters, they reveal an ongoing rebellion that humanity has committed against God, and the consequences that they have to endure in their environment, social and political structures as well. So for contemporary Christians, they highlight the universality of sin and the need for divine intervention. So these are the excerpts of the Bible that partially or explicitly highlight that. So from Genesis chapter 4, verse 8 to 15, it's a story of Cain, right, and how Cain invited Abel to go into the field. And when they were in the field, he killed him. And then a verse from verse 11 to 12, it's a similar thing God said as well to Adam and Eve, right? When they are cursed and they're banished from the Garden of Eden, but in a sense, they're cursed from the ground. And then after that, God gave Cain like a crest to mark that nobody is to kill him, because otherwise they would also suffer vengeance, sevenfold vengeance. So actually, the number 7 is mentioned quite a lot in the Bible. Like in Hebrew language, 7 is considered an important number, and I'll talk about that more later on. And as you can see from chapter 11, verse 4 to 7, that was the story of the Tower of Babel, when the common people decide to build themselves a city and a tower and make a name for themselves. And again, that was when God intervened in their affairs, in a bad sense, where he tried to confuse them so that they can't understand their speech. Lastly, this is more of a general overview from Genesis chapter 1 to 11 on the idea of covenant and redemption. So, in all chapters of Genesis, there's a common theme of covenant as well as redemption of sin that are found within those chapters. But also, these concepts, they later on set the stage for the need for restoration, spiritual restoration and salvation through the Messiah, the offspring of Mary, Jesus Christ. And I've set up here the covenant and the redemption verses. So in the covenant verses in Genesis chapter 6 to 9, God said to Noah, "But I will establish my covenant with you. You shall come into the ark, you, your son's wife, and your son's wives with you." And then there was a time where actually God displayed some human character where he changes his mind because he was moved by sort of like the sympathy that Noah had. That was another story, but he was moved, and then he said, after he smelled the pleasing odor from the offering that humanity has provided to him, he said, "I will never again curse the ground because of humans, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth." So it's kind of interesting that he said that this, yeah, it could have implied as well, like, from the time of Adam and Eve, the human heart's inclination changed. Prior to that, they were good, and then they changed because of the first original sin. And Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 to 17 mentioned how God made a covenant with Noah and also his sons. So, as for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you. I've set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And then in the redemption verses, chapters 3 and 9, he said, yeah, that was what I mentioned in the prologue as well. He will strike your head and he will strike his heel. And then in chapter 9 he said, I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So that was related to the flood narrative. Yeah, to attribute it to Noah. Okay, so the creation narrative, basically, as Ernest Lucas sums up, it contains figurative languages, and it's a symbolic literature, because the Hebrews, they used symbols to communicate their ideas, right? And an example of that in Genesis chapter 1 to 3 is, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea. So the Hebrews used the language of appearances a lot from Genesis chapters 1 to 7, where he said, so God made the dome and separated the waters. And when God, in verse 16, when God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And also another interesting phrase that was used was good, and very good. So he said that a lot after God had finished creating the planets, the animals. He said, and it was good, and it was very good. So he said that a couple of times to imply that the creation was planned, orderly, and purposeful. So it's kind of different to the way that the creation myths of the polytheistic cultures, that they created, that their gods created the universe out of violent struggle, or the battle against a god or towards a certain inferior god or something. And so there, yeah, a couple of parallels as well to Hebrew culture and languages. So as I've said before, the number 7, or Shabbat, I think that's how it's pronounced, it means complete or full in their language. And that was why the 7th day that was mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 verse 3 is significant, because that was when God rested after he created the world in 6 days. And it inspired the Sabbath, the rise of the Sabbath. And also Elohim, which is not in the Bible version that I use, but I think it's in another version, is a plural form of God, but it is understood in a singular sense, right? So in Hebrew thought, the word Elohim is used to highlight God's majesty and power, and that was why it was used. And Ruach in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 means spirit, wind, or breath of God. So in a particular verse, when the Ruach of God hovers over the waters, it sort of reflects the understanding that God's presence is creative and it's life-giving. The Spirit of God breathed into existence. And lastly, we have Aaron. Aaron means naked. So that's a reference to what I just discussed before, the chapter where Adam and Eve realized that they were naked. It correlates with Aaron in Genesis chapter 3 verse 1, where it describes the snake or the serpent as crafty. So it's funny in a way, but there's actually a connection between being naked, that it implies vulnerability in the characters, and also cunning behavior for some reason. I haven't really looked into it, but it was what I researched, so yeah. So there were a couple of factors that influenced the creation narrative. So there was the prevalence of polytheism, as I have said before, in the ancient Near East, particularly in Egypt and Babylonia. And at the time, the Hebrews, they also sort of formed acquaintances, and they had extensive interactions with people from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan. And also, I believe they have read their literature as well. And so there's 3 images. This one is a popular Babylonian creation epic from Egypt. That's Enuma Elish. So that creation story, it highlights the story that there's an orderly world created out of violent struggle when the god Marduk defeats sea goddess Tiamat. It's interesting that the name of the goddess is Tiamat, because in my language, Indonesian language, Kiamat, which is similar to Tiamat, it means the end, like the end of the world. Kiamat, Tiamat. Interesting coincidence. And created the world out of her divided body. So again, that signifies the violent struggle. So it sort of reminds me of Genesis chapter 1, verse 6 to 7, when God divided the waters. So again, there's a figurative language there when he divided the waters. I can't exactly remember what it was about, but it wasn't really a violent struggle. Yeah, anyway. And then second, we have the image of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was carved onto a stone tablet. It's I think a story that originated from Mesopotamia, and it's a story that tells us different gods attempting to flood the earth due to human wickedness. And then a man called Utnapishtim was chosen by the god Enki to build an ark. So again, that's the parallel, or could have been an inspiration to the flood narrative. And a last image is actually an image of the god Nun, sort of lifting up like a solar bark. Bark is like sort of like a boat. And from the Heliopolitan creation. So Heliopolis is a city in Egypt. So it's a story about Atum, the first god, who emerged from the Nun waters. So Nun basically is a word meaning primeval waters. Created other gods by spitting or coughing them out. Oh, do you want to take a picture of that? Or?
Yeah, I'm just taking a picture.
Oh, did you? Okay. I can share with you the slides if you want.
Oh, no, that's all right.
Okay. So there are a couple of controversies that were behind the creation narrative, and they're mostly set up by philosophers and scientists in the contemporary world, as you probably have already know. Yeah, you can guess. So, on creation and evolution, we have the debate against Christian apologist William Lane Craig and Lawrence Krauss. Krauss, I think that's how I pronounce his name. So they argue about the idea of creation and evolution in the debate, life, the universe, and everything. So Craig, the apologist, argued how everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? And he believed in the theory of fine-tuning, the theory that the universe is finely tuned and it cannot just be formed from random physical constants merging and colliding together. And that was also the idea that Lawrence Krauss put forward, quantum mechanics being responsible for the creation of the universe out of nothing. So just to sort of go backwards, the idea that the world was created by God in 6 days, it conflicts with scientific theories where the Earth has evolved already over billions of years, right? And, well, biblical literalists, or you call them young Earth creationists, because they believe that the age of the Earth is young. They believe that the Earth was only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, while scientists estimated the Earth to be 4.5 billion years old. So, also another idea of debate, another topic of debate is the idea that when Adam was formed from the ground and Eve from his rib, it sort of sparks the debate that humans are sort of exclusive to other primates that were created later on. You know? If humans have a rational mind and they have the capacity to distinguish between good and bad, does that make the animals less sentient beings? And that is something that I will talk about later on in the next 2 slides by Peter Singer. Second, this debate revolves around origin of sin. So the man in the left is Christian apologist and mathematician John Lennox. Interesting occupation, mathematician. And then the man on the right is Richard Dawkins, as you guys already know. So the debate that they had between each other was, has science buried God? So John Lennox argued that the concepts of right and wrong, or objective morality, is universal, and it sort of points to the reality of God. He doesn't agree with Dawkins when he said that morality is subject to each culture, in a sense, because it's sort of like a utilitarian way of viewing, the ethics of living. That what's good is something that's pleasurable, and what is not pleasurable is something that's not good. So Lennox argued that sin signifies disconnect from God, and living an ethical Christian life means acknowledging one's moral brokenness. That the idea that we're all broken ever since the fall took place, paving a way for redemption through Christ. On the other hand, Dawkins postulated how sin is a human invention, a social construct designed to control human behavior, and such establishment of moral absolutism can lead to oppression, violence, and war, speciesism, and other things.
Well, isn't it a human invention, the idea of sin? So we're talking about the Bible. The Bible's a human invention.
You can save the questions for later in the question and answer session. And the third is the debate around the interpretation of language. So, I'm sure there were other scientists or even philosophers that argue that the Bible condones slavery, or it talks about humans already being set up as slaves because that was what their lives were revolved around, making offerings to God. In this sense, in the Bible, in the Mesopotamian creation story, it talks about humans as being slaves because they're created like clay mixed with the blood of God. But in the Bible, humans, I should have put the verse in, but I didn't. They're simply but God's slaves that offer food and drinks or sacrifices, and they build houses or temples. So in that way, they're slaves, but not exactly. So that the gods don't have to do any work. And so it's sort of conscious to the idea that, if humans are crafted with care and intention, even though they're made out of the dust of the earth, and given the divine breath of life, Does that mean that they're slaves, really, practically? Exactly. So, according to Lucas, scientists and philosophers widen the interpretation of humans made in likeness of God to other sentient beings having equal rights. So that's the man on the right is Peter Singer. So he disagreed completely with the idea of speciesism, the idea that there's certain people that have exclusive rights and they're superior to others, and that all beings, regardless of their position or intelligence, are sentient. So, although God commanded humans to have dominion over creation, it doesn't really imply the right for humans to exploit nature according to their will. Alright, so it's a video that I want to show. So it's an interview of Ernest Lucas, the author of the Basis Interpreting Genesis.
And you wanted the sound, did you?
Yeah.
You'll have to attach to the speakers.
Okay.
So whereabouts is?
There.
Oh, okay, right.
If there be light, people who.
Yeah, it could be a male, it's got to be able to Okay, you should have another one there.
There's no cultural.
Really? It's racist, it's racist. Okay.
He's jumping into the Christians, he thinks it's the best of the story.
He's probably sitting there banging the gallon, he said, it's like that we get what something.
I only got things that I didn't know.
Right.
I'm gonna be glad if I
Start the video now.
I just said, oh, okay. Often that.
So if we got sound? Okay, yeah, then be linked to the speakers. Yeah, well, yeah. This is why we shouldn't check it out before we start.
next to law.
Okay, can we hear something? Oh, could we have
I think
mic?
it's, I think it's, hang on, is it this one?
Well, that's right. Others feel yeah, I don't really know. I just
Oh yeah, it's coming to you. Alright, start the video now.
Okay.
Do we mention there's audio or what? Do we just?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right, so come for the speakers.
I've already connected it. It's already connected.
And you know a lot about the early chapters of Genesis. Now, of course, when people hear about Genesis, they think, you know, this whole creation and days or
Yeah, it's, this is not very strong. I meant to use the speakers, but
interestingly,
So I need to repeat it. I can't hear it.
Yeah, let's go back to the start.
it means you have to find in your
No,
computer
just, let's,
the link to.
yeah, but since we don't have time to do this, let's just listen to it quietly.
Yeah, we'll
Is
just
that
go
okay?
back to it. Yes,
Alright.
yes.
Dr. Lucas, thanks very much for coming along, and we know that you're a biblical scholar and you're also a Hebrew scholar, and you know a lot about the early chapters of Genesis. Now, of course, when people hear about Genesis, they think, you know, this whole account of creation and days and all that kind of thing, and many people just think this is a fairy tale. I mean, is that just a fairy tale?
Well, interestingly, some historians of science would argue
And I think Lucas did highlight a point there that I find quite significant as well, is he gave a warning towards reading the Bible too literally, and he even stated here in his work that if we stand too close to the picture, as in like he's referring to the Bible, or at the wrong angle with the wrong expectations, it sort of led the Roman Catholic Church, he referred to in history, to condemn Copernicanism for its heliocentric astronomy. Yeah, in the 17th century, rather than revise the traditional interpretation of a handful of biblical texts. So it's basically, it's also not just symbolic literature filled with figurative language, but it's also prophetic literature, and it's sort of eschatological literature as well, because it talks about the future, right? That humanity will build its kingdom of heaven on earth after they fight the forces in Armageddon. Anyway, just go back to the slides.
That's the end of it.
Oh, just one more slide, just sort of like. Right, so to summarize, Genesis 1 to 11 contribute to contemporary Christian vision of humanity by providing a theological framework for humanity's role on earth, their dignity, and the need to solidify their relationship with God, and a historical foundation of how humanity lived through insult and miseries through God, and how they can transform and restore through Christ. And again, William Lane Craig referred to the Hebrew narrative as a mytho-history. So it is a history that is based on the Hebrew tradition and not to be interpreted literally. Thank you for listening. That's the end of it. Sorry?
I said, first stop clapping, has to explain why they stopped clapping first. Why stop clapping last? No, excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia, and for believers and non-believers, and for people who believe that humanity is faulty and in need of salvation, and those who believe He's perfect and can do everything perfectly. Well, we'll have some questions.
Do you remember what Swedenborg meant by taking the rib from Adam to create a woman?
Yeah, if I read
There's
it,
a correspondence, but I've forgotten what it was.
I can't recall now.
Neither can I. Because
Swedenborg was a mystic of the 18th century, which weirdly enough my ancestors followed, which I only discovered a few years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. He was born in 1688 and died in 1772.
Swedenborg was one of the, they call him sometimes there's various claimants of being the last Renaissance man. Swedenborg was originally a scientist,
Yeah.
and one of the more sophisticated scientists in Europe, and then they said, well, he went mad and he went religious in his later life. Now, curiously, even when he was religious, Swedenborg didn't believe in the 6,000 year story of the earth. He was, by his estimation, well aware of the geological layers of the earth, so he dismissed that from his vision of biblical history.
Yeah. He was a great mathematician too. He met Halley of Halley's Comet when he went over to England. He tried to meet Isaac Newton, but there's no documentation that he did in fact.
I think he was getting down. These Swedish authorities probably would have persecuted him, but he ended up spending most of his time in Holland or England, where you could sort of say anything and get away with it back in those days. Okay.
So as far as the rib goes, with Leo's question, from what I recall, I
I think Swedenborg says, because the rib cage actually protects our vital organs, the ribs give protection to a person's heart. So taking a rib from Adam and creating Eve was like a symbolic way of saying that Eve was created in order to help protect Adam, to protect the human race. They're the most important thing about them, which
You
is
needed the mummy.
which is their will, their volition, what they had in their heart. So it was a way of giving some protection to us. So in a sense,
Who said that?
Sweden.
Swedenborg.
Sweden. Oh.
You can read the 101 volumes of his religious theories if you want. But anyway, anybody else?
You've read most of
Bless
Swedenborg,
you.
haven't you?
No, there's a lot of books. Les?
Thanks, Natalia, for a really interesting and comprehensive talk. I was wondering your thoughts on, were hundreds of creationists around that time with the various tribes. And if we interpret the Jewish creation myth as mythological, not meant to be taken literally, what do you think of the other hundreds of creation myths around that time? Should we take those as not meant to be taken literally by their authors?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, could be symbolic as well. It really depends what you personally subscribe to. Because, I mean, like, I don't come from a monotheistic religion background either. My parents, they're really sort of Chinese folklore, pagan religion. But I went to a school that really, preaches the idea of monotheism. And I can see why, authors like Tom Holland, he mentioned that, I think in one of his books called Dominion, he talks about how we are all swimming in the waters of Christianity. Well, if you were to see it that way, then Christian morality, without realizing it still underpins many secular, Western societies. Yeah, so that's my answer to your question.
Okay. Barbara?
Yeah, according to science, when there was a singularity, or in Hinduism they call it pralaya, there was no space, so we couldn't relate to anything, so no space and there was no time. So these 6 days, as the universe expanded, maybe something was created because there was a bit of space. And now we got a lot of space and a lot of relativity. People relating to things and each other. And eventually, the idea is that it's going to go back to singularity and pralaya in Hinduism.
What do you mean by relating things? Can you elaborate?
If there was no relationship, there'd be no, you know what I mean? If you're not relating, we're relating to you finishing this lecture so we can get home.
That's a deep, that is a cruel deep.
No, you know what I mean? That is time.
Yeah.
That is time.
Okay. So what's your verdict?
I'm trying to figure out that. I think knowing what time is very important. And the Hinduism call it the great breath. When you yourself are breathing, you're like a balloon, you're breathing out like a balloon, and then you're inhaling, you're going inwards.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of like the whole universe is alive. It's not dead.
So does the Bible, I think.
Yeah. So the 6 days is sort of symbolic to there's no space, no time.
But God didn't really mention that.
Yeah, Jesus does. When he says I am, it's like the Buddhist concept when we're meditating, it's in mindfulness, it's in 12 steps.
it's in a whole lot of belief systems, and he actually says before I was, I am.
Before Abraham,
No, before I was. What was it he said before? So it's like
Abraham was.
always here.
Is that in the New Testament?
It's a breaking through this whole.
he called himself God.
It's breaking through this whole concept of the infinite and the eternal, the time and space. It's like breaking through it. You know. So this 6 days stuff. I mean,
Well, the idea of the all-powerful, infinite God was a product of Judaism, and to some degree Plato conceptualised the same concept or a similar concept. But all other religions, the gods were subject to the forces of nature. For example, the world existed before the gods, and it was in chaos, and somehow the gods emerged out of the world and created order. Which curiously, this is my interesting point about the very first lines in Genesis. I think line 1 is actually a preamble, and it's line 2 which relates to the first acts. And line 2 claims that God was there contemplating what might be called the chaos. So that would imply that at some point originally in the Hebrew religion, possibly God had not created the chaos. The chaos and God existed side by side. And then for some reason God being there for an infinite duration of time, at some point in that infinity decided to set order upon the chaos and create a world.
there was a sort of denial of the chaos.
Must have been terribly boring. Terribly boring.
Well, look, the mind of God, according to that tradition, is infinite, so we cannot judge. We are mere specks of dust compared to the grandeur of this Hebrew God. So what can we say? It's sort of like me going around and trying to tell the dog, how to invest in the share market. Not a chance.
The wolves of Wall Street, isn't it?
Huh?
The wolves of Wall Street.
Yeah. The wolves of Wall Street, human
yeah.
wolves, not doggy wolves.
Well, fair
It's
enough.
bulls, not wolves, bulls.
Bulls.
Yeah, so the ancient
Oh, there's
Egyptians.
wolves and bears, but when I think
There's a lot of wolves there as well.
a book or whatever called the wolves of Wall Street. Savage, doggy dog, yeah, exactly.
Talking,
Barbara.
Anyway,
yeah,
Okay, Barbara.
talking about chaos, Velikovsky says that Venus wasn't always a planet. He didn't know where it belonged. It was a comet with a long tail, which people saw upside down as a woman with long hair, Venus. And some people saw it as a dragon. The long tail of Venus as a dragon, the year of the dragon. So anyway, Venus eventually lost its tail and became a planet and found its orbit. So from chaos, there is order.
Okay, that's struggles with Boyd's law. But I won't go into Boyd's law, right? Okay, Les had something more to say.
Question for Natalia.
Yeah.
So Augustine, it seems he believed in the literal Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and the Eden. So he was the one who conceptualised this notion of original sin
Yeah.
that is then passed down from generation to generation, from which we need salvation from Jesus.
And
So it seems Augustine believed in the literal special creation of Adam and Eve at a point in time, and certainly didn't accept the evolutionary hypothesis. So if modern Christians want to do away with this special creation of Adam and Eve and the literal eating of the fruit, then what then becomes of the need for Jesus to save us from this original sin, if there was no original sin?
I
The
think,
next one.
can I say something
Yeah.
on that? I think that if we're looking at, because Raphael mentioned it as well, the concept of sin, I see it as being like the Buddhist concept of pain, you know, and
Yeah.
it's suggesting to us as we do meditation, for example, that we don't fight against it. It's kind of inevitable, I believe. You know, I mean, sin's a tricky one because, you know, then you get different definitions of what is sin. I think you'll sort of maybe making that reference. And, you know, but it's like, we're not meant to fight against it. It will happen. It's just a part of what we are. It's in the animal world too, I expect, but I don't know, I'm an animal. I can't.
Yes, you are.
I can't.
We settle the question of sin.
So, yeah, we're not struggling against it the way that we don't struggle against pain until it becomes suffering. That's the way I look at it.
I wonder sometimes with medieval man that such a question might have been more profound than for modern humans. Modern humans are different. Medieval man lived in different worlds. For example, Nietzsche, for example, will point out that us modern humans, our world is very complex. But we, individual human beings, are simply a quantity. And us poor moderns are spread over a vast amount of space, and we end up being very thin and very superficial, unfortunately, because we're rushing past everything in the modern world. We have time for nothing. Now, point out, say, in the medieval epoch, a person's world was generally very small. It was a small pond, but very deep. And so, for a medieval man, this whole question of sin, there might have been an understanding that we cannot reach today. He might have felt, in his simpler world, much deeper feelings. Perhaps we don't sort of get the feeling anymore.
Sorry.
There's something that was said in the Jung Society, that Cain and Abel are one person. It was the shadow. Like me, if I kill my shadow side, my dark side, I'm killing part of myself. It's not really killing another person.
Yeah.
It's destroying something that I don't like within myself.
But that shadow is part of your
That's
consciousness.
Jung. That's Carl Jung.
It's part of the consciousness.
Consciousness. You're getting rid of a shadow consciousness within yourself.
Abel was the goody.
Yeah, Abel was good. He was murdered.
He was the goody guy.
Yeah.
Okay, another one? Lewis.
And now that you mentioned Jung, Jung was a big reader of Swedenborg. And Swedenborg said, as you mentioned, that each character in the Bible actually represents a part of ourselves. So the whole Bible represents aspects of our own selves, like the bad part, the good part, the sinful part, the faithful part, the loving part, the hateful part. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, I found the movie easy. I think, what was the name of it? The Bible. In the beginning, you got not just 11 chapters, it gave you a whole 22 chapters. John Huston's epic 1966 film sort of covers the material in glorious technicolor, wasn't it? I love that film. Bit hard to find these days. I think you can get it on, find it in some places online though. Nobody's heard of the 1966 film, John Huston.
What was the title?
Maybe on YouTube.
The Bible in the Beginning, 1966. It had, let's see, George C. Scott played the part of Abraham. Stephen Boyd played the part of Nimrod when he climbed up the Tower of Babel. Magnificent scenes that really, that was the thing, of course. Hagar was the servant woman. He was, in the proper sense, wasn't actually a wife of Abraham. That was a servant of Sarah, his wife. And when she was unable to conceive at one point, because she was a young servant, she stood in place of her mistress.
I was gonna,
Go
I was
on.
gonna add to, sorry, what was your name? Louis, sorry. I was gonna add to your point that the Bible is also about genealogy.
Yeah.
Particularly in the Numbers, it talks about, you know, the descendants of the 12 tribes.
And how long they lived for. Methuselah was 969. Yeah, they all lived 600.
Just
You look at it,
Yeah.
yeah, like
Easy over.
Simeon, God, Judah, Issachar, and all the others. Yeah, that's genealogy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and he also said, yeah, give me a second. The descendants of Judah, their lineage and their clans by their ancestral houses, from 20 years open out. Oh, sorry, never mind. Scrap
Numbers.
that. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't the age. I thought that was the age. But I'll have a read.
Okay, so our times get limited, so
Yes.
any more questions? Okay, Ricardo.
Two things. With regard, what's your understanding of God saying not to eat from the fruit? Do you say it to Adam and Eve together, to Adam first, to him to pass on, or?
Well,
Or-
he said to Adam first, didn't he? If I'm not wrong.
You can say it.
Oh, he said to both. If I'm not wrong.
Tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah. And then Eve was the one who disobeyed.
Yes, but on the basis of what she heard or what Adam told her?
What?
Also, thanks.
It was a
What she
servant.
heard.
The servant said,
Well, because
"Well,
it's an interesting question, because if it's God to both,
Yeah.
then people make a thing of Eve's, or women generally are more unable to understand an injunction. But if it's in fact that he passed it on to Adam, and Adam
There's-
didn't explain it properly, or was idle with how he said it, then maybe the issue is men don't explain things enough to people around them.
Some people.
You got to bring in the snake.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's-
it's
but
not-
then,
it's not."
but then the next issue is when you talk about the issue of craft versus law.
Yeah.
So that's referring to the snake, yes?
Yeah, there's the snake.
So
Yeah.
the question is, what's the nakedness have to do there?
That's exactly what I'm doing.
So this
Is it that you think the snake has a form of nakedness, or is it?
It sort of brings up vulnerability from the,
Yeah, but
Loss of
well,
innocence.
well, there's also another theory saying that, you know, women are more drawn to the passions than the man. So in that sense, that was why she was tempted by the serpent. Yeah.
But just as a follow-up to that question,
Yeah.
for a follow-up, I didn't know that they were naked, and so the important thing is that it was, you've got to think of the symbology. So it was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and so they, and so it was the tempter, the snake, that said that if you eat the fruit of this tree, the knowledge of good and evil, and you will become like angels or gods, and you would know what's occurring. But the thing is that it, and so what the lesson seems to say to me is that if you compare humans with animals, animals don't really know. Of course, I don't definitely believe in this, but they're saying that as animals, they can't really tell the difference between good and evil. And
So they don't have an objective
Yeah. They didn't realise that they were naked and they were not embarrassed, and this was the result of Eve sort of listening to the tempter and saying, well, if you eat this, or she discussed it with Adam, her husband, and he also agreed and also ate the fruit. But it was basically the tempter who did this.
Well, before Eve ate the fruit, they were both immortal, right?
Yeah.
Because they were in the Garden of Eden. And after that was when they were banished and they had to live in suffering for the rest of their life.
When was the Bible written?
Okay, yeah.
When was the Bible written?
As we generally know it, in the Babylonian captivity.
Oh.
Yeah, they were
Really? When was that?
Way before.
Okay, so it's based on materials which existed prior.
When was the Ten Commandments written?
Oh, well, the Ten Commandments would have existed from a prior time, we assume. But the Bible as a collected work is believed to have been created in the Babylonian captivity.
And even Moses refers to earlier
So
books.
what year was that?
That was about 540 BC.
It can be. I don't think it can be. What do you,
How many people? Nobody could read.
No. The upper classes in that era, the merchants, were all well versed in reading. They actually had, in some ways, minds better than today. You can't say that they were inferior minds. They didn't know stuff we know today. But this piece of machinery was working very well.
Adam named the animals, and he must have remembered the names he gave them to. The Bible doesn't actually say he remembered the names he gave to the animals, but he must have been intelligent enough to name all the animals.
Well, that's man's ability is to create categories, to nominate.
Yeah.
Theoretically, animals don't have that ability.
Yeah. But I think if you read the Bible, what it says is that God gave Adam the responsibility of calling the names and so they were given the freedom to and so his humans who gave the names to it. God simply created these, and of course we've got different languages, and so there's different names for different animals in different languages.
Anyway, I'm sorry, is there anything more you want to say?
Just because I asked about the Ten Commandments, because in the Ten Commandments, the 6 days is mentioned.
Well, the Ten Commandments were given to Moses.
Yeah, and so it says 6 days you should work, the seventh day rest, because in 6 days a labour rule, and the seventh day rested.
And no other gods before me, and as far as we know, that rule was broken.
Oh,
Many times.
the golden calf.
Yeah.
Well, in the time of David and Solomon, there was Solomon who had foreign wives, and he allowed them to worship their foreign gods. So there were, altars and that built to foreign gods that weren't supposed to be there.
Why didn't Adam and Eve look like caveman? Like a cave woman and a caveman. They're always depicted beautiful. She's really beautiful and he's beautiful.
Yes.
Why? It's an idealistic interpretation. It's romanticism.
Anyway, we have limited time now, and if grab a cup of coffee or eat a bicky or whatever you like, and continue discussing, or you continue asking Natalia a question. And by the way, the seats can be piled 4 high along both these walls if you've got a chance to do that. Okay, thank you very much, Natalia.
You want to look like the Flintstones? They're in the Garden of Eden, they're going to be beautiful. Because everything's perfect.
It's like